Imagine a vast, frozen plain. The wind howls like a living ghost, dragging icy fingers across your skin. Towering in the distance, its silhouette rippling in the blizzard, stands a woolly mammoth, 6 tons of muscle, rage, and survival instinct. In the shadows, no spears are drawn, no arrows fly. Instead, a group of prehistoric humans wait patiently, wordlessly. Then, with a signal, a silent hand gesture, they move. Not to attack, but to guide, to manipulate, to outthink a beast that could kill them all in seconds. This isn't a story about brute force. It's a story about intelligence, about strategy, and about how the world's most dangerous prey was brought down by humans who didn't even have metal, let alone modern weapons. This is the true story of how early humans hunted mammoths, without spears, without bows, and without second chances. There are creatures in our myths so vast and terrible they feel like the earth itself took shape and walked. Dragons, titans, beasts made of stone and breath. But in the cold wind of the Pleistocene, such monsters were real. The woolly mammoth was not some exaggerated fable of the frozen world. It was 6 tons of heat and muscle wrapped in armor-thick hair and fat, striding across the snow like a moving mountain. Its skull alone could weigh more than a grizzly bear. Its tusks, each one longer than a man is tall, weren't just for show. They were tools, weapons, shields. And when one mammoth went down, the entire herd became a fortress. Imagine standing in the open tundra, breath stinging in your throat, looking up at that wall of life. You, a thin-skinned human in animal hides, no metal, no horses, no firearms. Just the crunch of ice under your feet and the sound of your own heartbeat, loud with fear. You don't get a second chance. You don't get to be wrong. And yet they hunted them, successfully. That single fact should stop us cold. Because when we picture Ice Age humans and mammoths, most of us imagine something cinematic but wildly inaccurate. A screaming mob of spear-wielding cavemen charging headlong into battle. Hollywood made it look like a football game with furs and tusks. But that's not how it happened. That's how you die. To understand why, you have to understand the mammoth not as a target, but as an ecosystem. Mammoths were the architects of their biome. They tore through Ice Age grasslands, clearing forests, shaping migration paths. They were smart, social, quick to defend their own. Their herds moved like schools of fish, tight and reactive, surrounding their calves in a defensive circle at the first sign of danger. The moment one adult sensed a threat, the rest responded instantly. And if one of those adults decided to charge, well, you wouldn't outrun it. A sprinting mammoth could hit 25 miles per hour. That's faster than Usain Bolt. And unlike a charging rhino, mammoths had the endurance to keep going. They didn't need to win the fight. They just needed to flatten you. And yet early humans still tried, because they had no choice. In the glacial world of the upper Paleolithic, calories were everything. One mammoth could feed dozens, maybe hundreds for weeks. Fat meat marrow, it was life, stored in bone and blood. And in the deep winter, when smaller prey migrated south or hibernated, when plant life vanished beneath 6 feet of snow, the mammoth remained. Cold, towering, and vital. But the environment didn't make it easy. The Ice Age wasn't just a time of cold, it was a time of unpredictability. Sudden blizzards, shifting ice shelves, months of darkness near the poles. Just stepping into the open to hunt was a calculated risk. You could lose toes to frostbite or vanish in a whiteout. Every step burned energy. Every breath cost heat. And if your plan failed, the mammoth wasn't the only one who might die. This wasn't a world of surplus. This was a world where mistakes killed entire families. So again, we have to ask, how did they do it? How did fragile, thin-skinned humans bring down 6-ton megafauna without the weapons we now think of as essential? No bronze, no iron, no composite bows. At most, they had sharpened sticks, crude flint, fire, and bone. That's it. And yet, across Europe, Siberia, and the Americas, we find the evidence. Mammoth kill sites surrounded by human tools. Scatter patterns of bones that suggest not just death, but planned death. Mammoths were not struck down by chance. They were stalked, studied, outsmarted. This wasn't a contest of strength. It was a contest of cognition. Because what humans had even then was something extraordinary: foresight, memory, collaboration, the ability to model a creature's behavior and plan for it, not just react but anticipate. Think of it like this: the mammoth was a puzzle and humans were the species that learned to solve it, not through brute force but through strategy, through terrain, through patience. This wasn't predator versus prey. It was more like chess played in snow, with lives on the line. And the biggest clue to that truth: there are almost no cave paintings of humans fighting mammoths directly. There are hunting scenes, yes, but they're distant, stylized, ritualistic. There's an absence of direct combat imagery, which raises a powerful possibility. Perhaps the kill wasn't a fight at all. Perhaps it was something quieter, slower, smarter. So if it wasn't spears, what was it? That's where the real story begins. Because the secret to hunting mammoths wasn't in the weapon, it was in the world itself. They didn't pierce the mammoth's heart. They guided it toward its own death. A cliff edge, a frozen lake, a pit dug in secret. And to do that, they needed something far more powerful than muscle. They needed to think like the mammoth. They needed to track its movements, read its fears, predict its choices before it made them. Which raises a new question, one that takes us out of myth and deep into memory. How do you track a beast that roams the edge of the known world? How do you follow something too large to chase and too important to lose? That's where we go next. Because before the trap, before the fall, before the fire and the feast, there is always the first footprint in the snow. And someone who sees it. And someone who remembers. Long before the hunt began, long before the mammoth was cornered, the trap laid, or the fire kindled, there was silence. A stillness broken only by the wind moving low across the ice. And in that stillness, a human crouched, eyes scanning the ground not for prey, but for something quieter, a whisper in the snow, a pattern, a trace, a sign. Tracking a mammoth was not a moment, it was a season. In the open expanses of the Ice Age steppe, the animals could vanish into the horizon like shadows. They didn't leave behind neon signs or maps, but they did leave footprints, broken sedge, half-gnawed bark, droppings still steaming in the morning cold, and that was enough. Because prehistoric humans weren't just hunters, they were readers of ground, of wind, of time. To track a mammoth meant knowing more than where it had been. It meant knowing where it was going. That's not just observation, that's prediction. And it points to something crucial. The tracking of giants was only possible because of a quiet revolution unfolding inside the human mind. We call it the cognitive revolution, and it changed everything. Roughly 70,000 years ago, something began to shift in the neural architecture of Homo sapiens. Not a sudden leap, but a slow, irreversible unfolding. Language grew more layered, memory more vivid, imagination more flexible. We began to tell stories, pass down information not just through action but through teaching, ritual, myth. And with that, we became more than just survivors. We became strategists. That was the real evolution, not in muscle, but in time travel. Humans learned to see beyond the now, to remember what came before and imagine what came next. It meant you could follow a mammoth trail across 10 days of travel, even if the tracks grew faint or the herd vanished into the distance. It meant you could study a windbreak of bent trees and know not only that the herd passed here, but how many, how fast, and when. We tend to underestimate what this meant. Today, if we lose something, we use GPS. If we want to find patterns, we check databases. But Ice Age humans had only their minds, and those minds were sharp. The brain of a seasoned tracker held not only the signs of the day, but the memory of every trail he had ever followed. He could look at the spacing between footprints in a line and tell whether the mammoth was walking or running, resting or anxious. If there was a calf in the group, he'd know from the smaller, unsteady depressions in the ground. If one animal limped, it left a signature, a drag of the foot, a hesitation at the edge of each step. These were not guesses, they were readings, and they weren't just visual. Skilled trackers listened to the echo of footfalls over ice. They smelled the wind for dung, sweat, musk. They felt the softness of the ground under their bare hands. Tracking wasn't just looking, it was knowing with your whole body. And perhaps most remarkable, this knowledge wasn't hoarded, it was taught. Children watched their elders trace patterns in the dirt. They were given fragments of bone and asked, "Which way did it walk?" They were told stories of trails, not bedtime tales, but memory scaffolds. A legend about a mammoth that favored the high valley in spring wasn't fantasy. It was a seasonal migration map, encoded in narrative, and passed down generation to generation. That's how entire communities could prepare for a mammoth hunt before ever seeing the animal. They knew from years of patterns when the herd would cross the valley, or pass the river bend, or graze in the tall grasslands beyond the glacial moraine. The landscape was not a mystery, it was a living memory. Even now, tens of thousands of years later, the ghosts of those tracks remain. In 2021, archaeologists in New Mexico uncovered a stunning find. A set of fossilized human footprints beside mammoth tracks preserved in ancient lakebed sediment. They stretch for miles, weaving, pausing, turning back. A mother carrying a child, a group walking single file, and alongside them the heavy indentations of mammoth feet, wide, round, patterned like sunbursts. The two species walked the same land, crossed paths. The evidence is not theoretical, it's pressed into the earth. But perhaps the most direct connection between then and now lives in the few cultures that still practice ancestral tracking. Among the Sand people of the Kalahari and the Aboriginal trackers of Australia's western desert, tracking remains an art form and a science. In these communities, an elder can still look at a single scuff of dirt and tell you the story of an animal that passed 3 hours ago. Its weight, its speed, whether it stopped to sniff the air or fled in panic. This knowledge is not mystical. It's learned, honed, trusted. And the methods echo those of Ice Age hunters, because tracking is a kind of intelligence that spans time and culture. It exists wherever humans must survive without certainty. That same intuition guided Ice Age hunters as they read the movement of clouds, the curl of wind through a valley, the direction of river ice. Mammoths were not aimless. They followed food, safety, habit, and so did the hunters. They knew the herds migrated south in winter, returning north in spring. They learned which passes bottlenecked herds, which riverbanks were soft with mud in summer and impassable in the melt. They understood that mammoths preferred open plains to dense forests, and that they often circled back to familiar salt licks or watering holes. This wasn't a chase. It was a dance, slow, deliberate, and ancient. To follow a mammoth was to follow a rhythm laid down long before you were born. But knowing where the mammoth would be was only half the challenge. The next step was deciding how to kill it. Because once you reached the herd, once you could smell the musk in the wind and see the tusks flash in the low sun, you were no longer alone. You were at the edge of something dangerous, something sacred. And from that moment on, every move mattered. Every noise, every shadow, every breath in the snow. Because giants may leave big footprints, but they're not easy to trap. And next, we'll see what it took to do exactly that. To turn the path of a mammoth into its grave. A mammoth does not stumble into death by accident. Not in a world where every inch of the tundra is open and the wind carries your scent for miles. To bring one down, you didn't just need strength. You needed a plan. You needed time. You needed the land itself. Because Ice Age humans didn't fight mammoths with brute force, they outbuilt them. Across the frozen continents, from the steppes of Russia to the river basins of North America, archaeologists have uncovered something extraordinary: kill sites. Not chaotic, random places where a mammoth simply collapsed, but carefully chosen, meticulously prepared death zones. Here, the mammoth didn't fall by luck. It was led to its death. Let's pause on that. Imagine standing in a treeless expanse, snow like chalk dust under your boots, and seeing a team of humans digging. Not with machines, not with shovels, but with antler picks, sharpened bones, and their bare hands, digging for days, maybe weeks, moving hundreds of pounds of frozen soil, lining the bottom with sharpened stakes, reinforcing the walls with mammoth bones, sod, logs, concealing it all beneath a thin skin of brush and snow. This wasn't a random ambush. This was architecture. Kill pits like these have been found across Ice Age Eurasia. In what's now Poland, a cluster of mammoth bones was discovered arranged at the bottom of what was once a depression, an ancient pit. In the Americas, especially at sites like the famous Mammoth Trap in Utah, archaeologists have found dozens of mammoth remains layered in what can only be described as a purpose-built slaughter site, reused over generations. Why go to such lengths? Because a mammoth that fell was a mammoth that couldn't fight back. And humans knew it. But traps weren't limited to pits. Sometimes the land itself was the weapon. A cliff face, a hidden sinkhole, a frozen bog. These were nature's blades. All you had to do was aim the mammoth at them. At the La Côte de Saint-Brelade site in Jersey, off the coast of modern-day France, bones from at least 20 mammoths were found piled at the base of a ravine. For decades, no one understood how they got there, until further analysis revealed a chilling probability. The mammoths were driven off the cliff by coordinated human effort. Imagine it, dozens of hunters spreading out across the plateau, forming a human funnel, slowly pushing the herd toward the drop. No sudden noise, no rushing, just pressure, cunning, design. This is not a cartoon of cavemen screaming into battle. This is silent warfare. This is chess in motion. And it demanded a level of coordination that still stuns us today. Because a mammoth trap wasn't just a physical structure, it was a social one. A web of people, each with a role. Some scouting the herd, others preparing the land. Some lying in wait, hidden in snowdrifts or behind rocky outcrops. No radios, no written maps. Just memory, gesture, ritual, and intuition passed through time. And the scale of these operations, enormous. At the site of Kostenki in Russia, archaeologists uncovered circular mammoth bone structures, rings made of hundreds of bones, some possibly the remnants of shelters, others perhaps processing stations for meat and hide. The kill itself may have taken a single day, but the planning, the coordination, the setup, that took weeks, maybe longer. We tend to forget that patience was one of humanity's oldest tools. You can't rush a mammoth, you lure it, you shape its choices. If you wanted to drive it into a bog, you had to know where the ground was soft enough to hold its weight, but firm enough to carry your own. If you wanted to corner it between two ice shelves, you had to wait for the perfect season, the moment when cracks formed beneath the snow, invisible until stepped upon. In other words, mammoth hunting was engineering. It was about leverage, geometry, timing, and underneath it all, communication. But how do you coordinate 30, maybe 40 people in open terrain without shouting? You don't use words, you use signs. There's evidence that prehistoric humans developed elaborate gesture systems, not full languages, but enough to pass complex tactical information across space. Stop, flank, move left, distract now. When silence meant survival, every glance mattered. Every hand signal was a promise. Trust me, follow, hold. And beyond gesture, there were rituals, dances, chants, fire patterns, not just for ceremony, but for cohesion, to create shared focus, to remind everyone, this is bigger than any one of us. Because one mistake, one misstep could cost lives. And there was no second chance. Once the herd was in motion, there was no calling it back. The funnel either worked or it didn't. The mammoths either turned toward the trap or toward you. And so, everything had to be perfect. And often it was. That's why we find so many mammoth remains clustered in specific sites. The kill wasn't accidental. It was designed. And the people who pulled it off weren't just hunters. They were engineers, strategists, architects of the ice. Even in death, the mammoth tells the story. The way its bones are scattered tells us how it fell, how it landed. Spiral fractures on leg bones suggest it struggled, kicked, tried to rise. Breaks in the ribs hint at the collapse. The angle of the tusks tells us whether it fell forward or back. Even the position of the skull can show which way it turned in its final second. We're not guessing anymore. We're reconstructing. And what we see is not a brutal free-for-all, but a masterpiece of patience and planning. But the moment the mammoth hit the ground, the work wasn't over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. Because a mammoth carcass wasn't just food, it was future. Thousands of pounds of meat, fat, tendon, bone, ivory. Enough to feed dozens through a bitter winter. Enough to make tools, tents, thread, needles, ropes, ornaments. But it all had to be processed quickly before predators arrived, before rot set in, before the wind stole away the warmth of success. And that's where the whole community came in. Because the kill site became a hive, not just a battlefield, a village in motion, fires lit, meat carved, hide stretched, bone shaped. And with it, a kind of miracle. For a brief moment in time, in the shadow of a fallen giant, early humans turned the harsh, frozen world into something else, a place of warmth, of purpose, of survival through cooperation. A triumph not of teeth, but of mind. But the mind doesn't only remember the hunt. It remembers the fall, the moment of death, the blood in the snow, the cost. And that's what we'll explore next. Because to hunt a mammoth was to kill something deeply sacred. And in the silence after the kill, the rituals began. There's a scene burned into our collective imagination, passed down by cartoons, textbooks, and action movies. A shaggy mammoth charging across an ice age plain, pursued by wild-eyed men with spears, shouting and running full tilt into danger. It's dramatic, it's cinematic, and it's almost entirely wrong. Because in reality, Ice Age humans didn't chase mammoths. They guided them. They turned the open tundra into a pressure system, a psychological trap made not of ropes or cages, but of fear, noise, shape, and time. The mammoths moved because we made them want to move, not with weapons, but with suggestion. The truth is more elegant than fiction, and far more haunting. To understand this invisible chase, you have to start with the mammoth itself. Despite their size, and perhaps because of it, mammoths were deeply emotional creatures. Their brains were massive, more complex in some areas than even our own. They were social, familial, tightly bound to their herds. And just like modern elephants, they reacted not just to physical threats, but to the idea of threat. If one mammoth spooked, others followed. If a matriarch sensed danger, the entire herd shifted, not in panic, but in caution, in ripple. And early humans knew how to tap that ripple. They didn't rush, they didn't scream, they moved slowly, deliberately, in silence or in sound, whichever served the plan. The key was pressure, the illusion of danger on one side, safety on the other. It's the same principle used by wolves. When wolves hunt large prey like elk or bison, they don't launch into a reckless attack. They flank, they probe, they test the edges of the herd. They guide it toward terrain that favors them, a ravine, a slope, a patch of ice. The kill happens after the animal is already lost. And Ice Age humans hunted the same way, not as lone predators, but as coordinated pressure systems. Picture this: the mammoth herd grazes near a riverbank. Upwind, a team of humans waits quietly. Their scent is carried into the herd. Eyes rise, ears twitch. There is no attack, just presence. On the far side of the river, a line of fires begins to flicker into life. Not large, just enough to glow, enough to hint. The mammoths don't know where to go, but they know where not to go. Slowly, over hours, maybe days, they begin to shift their grazing pattern. Not because they're forced to, but because the world around them has subtly changed. Too much smell on the wind, too many shadows, too much noise. So they move, and unknowingly, they begin to walk into the trap. This method of soft steering is not speculation. It's embedded in the archaeological record and echoed in modern indigenous practice. In East Africa, the Maasai are known for herding cattle without fences, just through movement, position, tone. They don't run, they guide, sometimes with nothing more than a raised arm or a distant whistle. It's not coercion, it's choreography. And that choreography is something Ice Age humans understood intimately. They used the terrain like a conductor uses instruments. A narrow valley became a funnel. A line of brush, burned deliberately, became a visual wall. A frozen lake, treacherous to cross, became a natural deterrent, not a barrier, but a choice architecture. The mammoths didn't feel hunted. They felt surrounded. At the site of Olorgesailie in Kenya, long before the Ice Age reached its full fury, early humans used long lines of stone hand axes, laid down in tight patterns, to direct herd animals into bottlenecks where they could be killed more easily. These stone tools weren't dropped randomly. They were placed. It's one of the earliest known examples of terrain manipulation, and it worked. Tens of thousands of years later, at La Côte de Saint-Brelade, the same site where mammoths were found piled at the base of a ravine, researchers believe something similar occurred. A deliberate use of presence, terrain, and pressure to funnel the herd toward the cliff. The humans may never have touched the animals, but they touched their minds. And then there's patience. Because this kind of hunting wasn't fast, it wasn't about adrenaline. It was about time, days of movement, waiting, watching, holding position in wind and snow, letting the herd make the wrong decision over and over until there were no more good options left. This is the part we rarely tell in our stories, the waiting. A human sitting behind a rock for 6 hours, unmoving, as the herd grazes just out of sight. Another creeping along a slope to replace a fallen noise barrier. Someone lying awake all night, listening for the first tremble of movement on the ice. It was slow warfare, not of bodies but of intention. And it wasn't done alone. These were group hunts, dynamic, multi-stage operations requiring real-time coordination without sound. Gesture systems evolved. A raised hand meant hold. A sweeping arm meant move. Firelight signaled position across distance. A child sent ahead might shout not to scare the mammoths, but to make them move just enough. It wasn't chaos, it was symphony. Every step was a choice, not just by the hunters, but by the mammoths. And that's the power of this method. It didn't force the animals. It manipulated their instincts, used their fear, their loyalty, their memories of old paths and safe zones against them. To the mammoth, it probably didn't feel like a hunt at all, until it was too late. Because eventually, after hours or days of gentle pressure, the herd found itself exactly where the humans wanted, at the edge of a ravine, at the lip of a bog, facing a wall of fire, with nowhere left to turn. And that's when the illusion vanished. That's when the spear came. But even then, it was almost unnecessary, because the real kill had already happened hours earlier, when the first mammoth chose to step away from safety. And all of this invisible strategy reveals something profound: that the Ice Age was not ruled by muscle or fury. It was ruled by psychology, by patience, by design. It shows that our ancestors weren't just clever, they were emotionally intelligent. They understood not only how the mammoth moved, but why. They hunted, yes, but they also listened. They watched. They waited until the world tilted in their favor. And in doing so, they survived a world of giants. But even victory had its price. Because once the mammoth lay dead, once the adrenaline faded and the snow turned red, something else began to stir. A reckoning, a ritual, a grief. And in the next chapter, we enter the sacred space at the heart of the hunt, where blood meets memory, and the fallen giant is not only butchered, but mourned. When we picture a weapon, we picture something gripped in the hand, something lifted, thrown, driven through muscle and bone with the force of rage or survival. But Ice Age humans, at least those who hunted mammoths, often didn't need weapons like that. What they had were ideas, and gravity, and patience. A mammoth was not an animal you could pierce, not easily. Its hide alone could be 2 inches thick, tougher than modern Kevlar. Beneath that, fat, then muscle, then a rib cage built to withstand collisions with trees. Even if you managed to drive a spear into its side, it might keep moving. It might turn on you. It might crush you beneath 10 tons of prehistoric vengeance. So humans used what they had, not to attack but to prepare. They built weapons that didn't look like weapons. And they waited. Let's start with the blade, not the one in the chase, but the one that comes after. In archaeological sites across Eurasia and the Americas, we find flint tools buried among shattered mammoth bones, razor-thin blades chipped from obsidian and chert, not shaped like swords, but more like surgical scalpels. Their role wasn't to kill, it was to open, to separate tendon from bone, to flinch the hide, to carve out the meat from where the spear never could have reached. Some of these blades were so fine, they could slice through mammoth sinew with no more pressure than a gentle draw of the hand. They were tools of reverence as much as efficiency, because killing the mammoth was only part of the story. The real labor, the real intimacy began at death. But let's rewind to before the first cut, to the trap. The most astonishing thing about mammoth hunts is not how humans killed mammoths, but how they convinced mammoths to kill themselves. Take pit traps. In places like Mezhyrich in Ukraine or Via Tesselos in Hungary, we find enormous depressions in the earth, lined with bone and stone. They weren't natural. They were built, shaped with antler picks and fire-hardened stakes. Some were up to 10 feet deep, just enough that once a mammoth fell in, escape was impossible. And around them, stakes, sometimes fire, sometimes nothing at all, just a blind spot in the terrain, a moment of misstep in snow, a false sense of ground. These pits didn't act immediately. They were patient. They waited. A mammoth could take days to stumble into one, but once it did, there was no battle, only gravity, only inevitability. And from there, the kill became a slow ritual, more methodical than violent. But even when traps weren't dug, humans used the world itself as a kind of weapon. A bog, half frozen, crusted with early morning ice. One wrong step and a 4-ton bull mammoth could sink chest-deep in sludge, its weight working against it, each struggle pulling it deeper. A slope dusted in snow, a canyon edge hidden by brush, a sudden drop into a frozen gully. The terrain looked harmless, but it was loaded, like a spring, like a snare. And in some cases, it was literally engineered. Trigger-based traps, the prehistoric equivalent of tripwires, have been theorized based on analogs with modern hunter-gatherer societies. Snares woven from rawhide or twisted sinew. Deadfalls of massive logs balanced on a notch, waiting for a footstep to release them. These weren't fantasy. They were physics, and they were deadly. Because the human advantage wasn't muscle, it was design. Consider this: a single upright pole buried deep into a mammoth trail, sharpened at the top, its point hardened by flame. On its own, it means nothing, but position that stake on the inside bend of a forced turn, where mammoths would be herded to shift their weight suddenly, and it becomes a weapon of momentum. Not human momentum, mammoth momentum. Let a 5-ton body stumble into it, shoulder first, at a slight downward angle, and suddenly physics becomes a spear. No throwing required. This is the genius of Ice Age hunting. Nothing looked like a weapon until it worked. Fire, too, was a weapon, though not in the way we think. Humans didn't throw fire at mammoths. That's fantasy. Fire was too precious, too unstable, but it could be used around mammoths as a boundary, a corral, a whispering line of heat and light that shifted their choices. A single torch held on a ridge at night could suggest the presence of danger. A wall of smoke, smoldering just upwind, could block a known migration path. Not a wall, but a suggestion of one. The mammoths chose to move away. The humans simply arranged the world so that away meant into the trap. It's a kind of psychological aikido, using the enemy's own motion, fear, and size against them. And it's not just theory. The mammoth bone sites we've uncovered in places like La Côte de Saint-Brelade or the Czech site of Dolní Věstonice show signs of pre-planned kill zones. In some cases, bones are arranged in circular patterns, likely used to corral or confuse. In others, The layering of remains suggests repeated use of the same engineered space, a prehistoric hunting stage. And through all of this, one thing becomes clear: that early humans were not chaotic predators lashing out at the wild. They were architects of the impossible. They built situations where death became a side effect. And in doing so, they didn't just survive. They rewrote the rules of predation. Because a lion can chase, a wolf can bite, but only a human can lay a trap and wait for physics to finish the job. And the aftermath of those traps, that's where the real work began. Cutting, hauling, preserving, and remembering. Because every mammoth death carved something deeper than meat into the people who stood around it. It carved stories, lessons, warnings, tools made from memory. And those memories were kept alive, not in books but in bones. Not in museums, but in fire circles and whispered songs. And it's those bones we turn to next. Because the story of the mammoth doesn't end in the trap. It echoes through what the humans did after the kill. The shaping, the burying, the building of huts from tusks and skulls, the reverence carved into ivory. In the next chapter, we explore what was left behind and how the dead mammoth became not just food, but structure, shelter, and story. The wind has teeth. It howls across the ice-bound cliffs of what we now call La Côte de Saint-Brelade, curling through dead pines and the ribs of distant peaks. Snow drifts in sheets, but beneath the white silence there's motion, breath, heat, waiting. And just beyond the stone ridge an outline, immense, shaggy, alive. A mammoth. She moves slow but deliberate, flanked by her herd, dark shadows in the pale distance. Her feet press into frost-bitten earth, each step a muted thunder. She does not know she is walking toward death. But the boy does. He crouches in a rock hollow barely large enough to curl into, his fingers pressed against the cold stone. His name is long forgotten, swallowed by time, but we will call him what he is, the Watcher. His heart is racing, though he barely moves. Everything depends on silence. Not stillness, that's easy, but silence of breath, of thought, of fear. They've waited 5 days for this. 5 days of smoke and false walls, of pre-dawn signals and flares of fire on the ridgeline, of closing off the western pass and lining the eastern route with scree and stone. 5 days of coaxing the herd toward the narrow channel, the kill chute, carved not by humans, but by ice age erosion and time. Today is the last day. And now they are in position. 30 humans fanned out in a crescent beyond the slope, hiding in natural alcoves and behind the knuckled roots of petrified trees. Most hold nothing in their hands. They don't need weapons. Not yet. The trap is already set. The lead mammoth lifts her trunk, testing the air. There's smoke, faint and old, nothing to panic over. Her ears flap, slow, relaxed. The others follow, calves bumping their mother's sides, males trailing further back. Then movement. A child no older than 10 winters rises on the far ridge and waves a burning branch. Not at the mammoths, near them. The signal is not aggression, it's choreography, a note in a silent song. The mammoths shift, uneasy. The slope is narrowing. Now come the sounds, calls from the flank, stone on stone, percussion bursts, echoes in the canyon walls. From high above, another figure sets a small rockfall tumbling, not to hit the herd but to stir it, to guide it. They're driving the herd, not like wolves but like wind. The watcher sees it, the matriarch's hesitation. She smells something. Blood. No, not yet, but the wrongness of the terrain. The path she's walked every year feels off. The sounds, the echoes, they're not right. She bellows, but it's too late. Behind her, younger mammoths push forward in confusion. The path narrows further. Snow gives way to frost-shattered stone. The ground beneath, seemingly solid, is actually split by cracks, ice-veiled gaps left by ancient frost heaves. The first trap is not a pit. It's the earth itself. Her front foot breaks through the crust, plunging knee-deep. She roars, wrenching backward, but the ice beneath collapses in a cascade. One leg, then two, buckle into the void. Her weight shifts. The rear leg slips. She falls. And the sound is not one of a single death. It's a signal. A thunderclap that triggers the next wave. Humans rise as one. From the sides of the kill chute they emerge, shouting, waving arms, casting fire. No spears, no blades, just sound, chaos, pressure. The rest of the herd panics. Some bolt up the slope and are allowed to flee. That's part of the design. The kill zone can't be crowded. The others, the ones too near the fallen matriarch, stumble in the chaos. One crashes into her side, cracking a leg. Another slips and careens into a narrow rockfall, shattering its hip. The terrain finishes what the humans started. In less than a minute, it's over. Two mammoths dead, one dying, a fourth, limping, escapes into the white. And then silence. Not peace, never that, but a silence thick with adrenaline, steam, and something older. Something sacred. The watcher emerges from his hollow, knees trembling. His fingers are raw from gripping stone, but his eyes are wide, not with fear but awe. This is his first kill. He walks slowly toward the fallen matriarch. She's still alive. Her breath fogs in slow clouds. Her eye, the size of a clenched fist, blinks once. There is no malice, only confusion, pain. The humans circle her, keeping distance. She's dangerous still. A swing of the trunk, even in death throes, could break bone. But they do not strike. Not yet. They wait. The oldest among them, a woman with silver in her hair and blackened toes from past frostbite, steps forward. She carries no weapon, only a handful of red ochre. She kneels beside the mammoth's head, whispers something no one else can hear, and presses the ochre to her own lips, then the mammoth's brow. It is not ceremony for show. There is no audience here, only meaning. Because to kill something this massive, this intelligent, is not just survival, it is trespass. The ochre is apology, gratitude, memory. Then and only then do the blades come out. Not to stab, but to free. The meat, the skin, the sinew, every part has a purpose. The tusks will become walls. The stomach lining, storage. The hide, layered and smoked, will keep out the wind. The watcher stands back as the others work. He sees not a corpse, but a gift. a sacrifice, and he knows in his marrow that every kill is also a story. Later they will eat, later they will sing. But now they preserve. Now they remember. And in the low light of the setting sun, they mark the kill site with a line of stones, not to warn others but to say, "Here the earth provided." This was no chase, no duel, no glory. It was a collaboration between mind, terrain, and time. And this story, the boy's story, will live on. Etched in charcoal on cave walls, whispered in bone flutes, painted in ochre and blood and firelight, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. Until one day, tens of thousands of years later, we find the bones. We find the tools, the traps, the soot lines and cracked rock and piles of shattered ribs. And we ask how. How did they do it? The answer is here, not in brute strength, but in the quiet, in the stillness, in the planning and the fear and the fire. In that moment before the fall, and the long silence after. But the story doesn't end with the hunt. It begins again with what comes next. How do you preserve a mammoth in a world without ice boxes? How do you feed a tribe through an endless winter? In the next chapter, we'll follow what happens after the kill. The cooking, the storing, the sharing, and the beginning of something that would one day become society. The mammoth is dead, but the story is far from over. In fact, for the humans who hunted it, the real work has only just begun. The kill is not an ending, it's a beginning, a transformation. A single mammoth could weigh over 10 tons. That's more than 200,000 calories per person for a group of 30. But calories alone don't explain the gravity of what just happened. The body of this fallen giant is more than food. It is fuel for winter, shelter for the coming storms. It is memory, technology, and continuity bundled into one colossal, sacred creature. In the mammoth's death, a kind of economy is born, an ice age infrastructure. The mammoth, in all its parts, will become the bones of a civilization. First, there is the butchering. This is not frantic hacking. It's not mindless bloodlust. It's anatomy, strategy, a practice honed over tens of thousands of years, passed down through scarred hands and silent gestures. Flint blades, some no larger than a leaf, are wielded with surgical precision. They carve through thick fur and fatty layers, opening the body in sections. First the legs, then the ribs, then the immense organs nestled beneath. The skin is peeled back like a heavy curtain. It takes 6 or more people to shift it aside, folding it carefully to keep snow from falling into the open cavity. Children and elders don't watch idly, they have their own tasks. The young collect stripped bones, sort usable sinew, and gather kindling to keep fires lit through the long work. Elders monitor, guide, and sometimes sing. Low, rhythmic chants that carry through the cold air, part instruction, part invocation. The mammoth's fat, especially from the hump above its shoulders, is harvested first. Rich in calories and long-burning when dried, it is as valuable as the meat itself. The organs are prized too: heart, liver, lungs, cooked immediately or buried in snow for later. Nothing is wasted. Even the contents of the stomach may be used, partially digested plants that can be boiled or fed to dogs. But what truly shows the genius of these ancient humans is what happens next: storage. Without refrigeration, without salt, and facing months of relentless cold, preserving the meat becomes a second kind of hunt, a race against decay. Here, the earth itself becomes the freezer. Meat slabs are buried in shallow permafrost pits lined with mammoth hide and moss, the natural insulation keeping scavengers out and cold locked in. Some sites show signs of stone lids, weighted carefully, likely to keep out wolves or snowdrifts. In colder regions, entire quarters of mammoth were left outside, exposed to sub-zero air where they could freeze solid for months. Sometimes the kill site itself became a processing center, a temporary village. Fires ring the perimeter. Smoke spirals into the sky both for warmth and preservation. Meat is cut into long, thin strips hung on wooden racks and slowly dried into a kind of Ice Age jerky. It could last for weeks, maybe longer. And then there are the bones. Massive, dense, and curved like ivory ribs of a sunken ship, mammoth bones are not debris. They are building materials, tools, storytellers. Tusks are carved into spears, sled runners, and musical instruments. Skull domes form the frames of windproof huts, draped in hides and sealed with mud or snow. Ribs are turned into drying racks. Leg bones become digging tools. Even the marrow, thick and nutrient-rich, is extracted with care. Some sites, like the extraordinary dwellings found in Ukraine, show entire villages built from mammoth bones. Thousands of them, arranged in circles reinforced with earth and fur. They were not just structures, they were shrines, monuments to survival, and maybe to memory. Because something happens at these kill sites that is harder to measure than meat weight or bone usage. People stay. They don't just kill and leave. They linger, they cook together, they tell stories. They etch on bones, zigzag patterns, animals, even early forms of counting. They dance in the firelight. They bury their dead nearby. The mammoth becomes a kind of center, a gravitational pull around which Ice Age life can temporarily orbit. Not a city, not even a village, but something in between, a proto-society, a momentary civilization forged in the cold. And here's the astonishing part: we can still see this. At sites like the Chilerosa Basin or Yana RHS in Siberia, archaeologists have found clear evidence of ritual activity at kill sites. Bone caches arranged deliberately, charcoal rings from controlled fire pits, and tools that were made, used, and then left, not lost, but offered. This wasn't just survival, it was culture. The mammoth wasn't just prey, it was myth. Some bones bear scratches that seem to count, perhaps days since the kill or members of a hunting party. Others are carved with figures, animals, lines, and spirals. These weren't decorations. They were memory devices, a kind of Ice Age archive. Because when nothing is written, everything must be remembered. And what better place to remember than here, where life was taken and given? The children who played among the bones would one day lead the hunts. The old ones who sat near the fire would speak of kills long past. The site itself would be revisited, months, maybe years later, not to hunt again, but to remember. And this is what the mammoth gave that no other animal could. Not just sustenance, not just shelter, but continuity. It bridged the gap between one winter and the next, between knowledge and instinct, between a solitary survival and a shared story. The mammoth was economy, but it was also memory. A memory so large, it had to be carved into tusks and stacked into houses and sung in chants that no archaeologist will ever hear again. But if you stand still, even now, among the scattered bones in an ancient field, if you let the wind speak and close your eyes, you can almost feel it. The heat of the fire, the murmur of voices, the heavy breath of something sacred fading into the snow. And from here, our story moves forward. Because what the mammoth gave was more than food. It gave time. Time to think, time to share, time to dream up something more than survival. In the next chapter, we'll explore the echoes of this gift, the birth of Ice Age religion, symbolism, and the strange, beautiful art etched into the dark stone of caves. Because the mammoth didn't just live in the world. It began to live in the human mind. And there it would never truly die. They were always there. At the edge of the clearing, peering from behind boulders, kneeling in the snow, fingers dug deep into frost-bitten soil, watching, not with idle curiosity, but with wide, silent eyes that drank in everything. The children, not warriors, not hunters, not leaders. Not yet. But they were watching. At multiple Ice Age kill sites, long after the bones have been cataloged and the tools drawn, archaeologists find something more intimate. Footprints, tiny ones, pressed into the earth beside those of mammoths, wolves, and adult humans. Fossilized in mud hardened by time, they tell a quiet story that stone tools cannot. Children stood there. Children witnessed the hunt. Children saw death before they ever held a weapon. In a site in New Mexico's Chilarosa Basin, a child's footprints run beside an adult's for over a mile across wet clay, sometimes skipping, sometimes pausing. At another site in Siberia, small prints circle mammoth bones and burnt debris, not just watching but touching, exploring, participating in a way we are only beginning to understand. And what did they feel? Not safety, not joy, but something deeper, a mix of fear, awe, confusion, and reverence. These children weren't protected from the harshness of life. They were raised inside of it. The mammoth's death was not just a spectacle, it was a lesson. A moment where survival, power, pain, and purpose all collided. They saw the blood. They smelled it. They heard the cries of the animal, of the people, of the earth itself when the ground trembled under the weight of it all. This was education, Ice Age style. No chalk, no paper, just bone and blood and story. Because once the fire was lit and the danger had passed, the storytelling began. A father might take his child to the side and retell what had happened, using his hands, his breath, the arc of his shoulders to show how the mammoth had turned, how the cliff had given way, how the people had worked as one. A mother might whisper into her daughter's ear as she carved bone beads, linking the story of the kill to the story of her own family. This is where your uncle was trampled. This is where we waited for the snow to stop falling. This is where you will one day stand. These stories weren't entertainment. They were blueprints, teaching how to move, how to think, how to feel in the face of danger, and how to remember. In a world with no books, memory was everything, and emotion was the glue that held it fast. Fear, joy, pride, grief, all woven into the neural map of a child's growing brain, making the hunt not just a tale, but a cornerstone of identity. The children who watched were not passive. They were absorbing, integrating, becoming. And this is where trauma and beauty intersect, because some of those children likely had nightmares. Some may have cried quietly into furs as the fires died down. Some grew up with visions of collapsing giants and goring tusks, etched into their minds alongside the rhythms of songs and the glow of stories. But that's the paradox of life at the edge. Danger didn't just kill, it taught. It sculpted young minds with precision no modern school ever could. And what they learned wasn't just how to hunt, it was how to be human. They learned patience, waiting in silence for hours as the elders prepared. They learned cooperation, watching how gesture and glance replaced words in the critical moment. They learned humility, seeing a creature the size of a house brought down not by strength, but by cunning. And they learned grief, mourning those who didn't return. Because sometimes the mammoth wasn't the only one who died. And when that happened, the children remembered most of all. The name of the fallen was passed on through story, through ritual, sometimes through naming. A newborn might be given the name of a lost uncle, binding the present to the past through memory and meaning. Some sites show stones arranged in patterns that don't make sense for hunting, but make perfect sense for mourning. Death was never the end. For children, it was a beginning, a moment that marked them, a memory that would echo through everything they became. And decades later, when their own children stood at the edge of a clearing, peering out at the shape of another mammoth across the snow, they would tell the same stories. They would point to the same hill. They would touch the bones still buried under the frozen earth and say, "This is where we became us." Because the kill wasn't just survival. It was culture. It was continuity. The children who watched became the adults who remembered, and the memory itself became the spine of Ice Age identity, one that stretched not just across generations, but across continents. And so the story carried on, not in ink, not in stone, but in footsteps, in glances, in the long, slow look a child gives to a world they cannot yet control but deeply, instinctively belong to. The mammoth may have fallen, but in the quiet eyes of a child, something else was rising. Understanding, resilience, humanity. And that brings us to the next layer of this ancient consciousness. The moment when these memories weren't just passed on through voice or gesture, but carved into the walls of sacred stone. Because some of the children who watched grew up to paint, to scratch images of mammoths onto the walls of caves no light could reach. And what they painted might just be the earliest version of us trying to explain what we were becoming. In the next chapter, we step into the dark, and we follow them. Beneath the frost of 1,000 winters, they are still moving. The mammoths, the hunters, the children, their stories are not gone. They are frozen in time, whispered in the layers of ice and the patterns of bone left behind like the closing lines of a poem no one remembers writing. And slowly, carefully, modern science has begun to read it again. It starts with a footprint, not just its shape, but its depth, its spacing. Whether the soil was wet, whether the animal was limping, whether the hunter was walking or sprinting. The team at White Sands, New Mexico, uncovered an entire ghost caravan, ancient human tracks trailing those of giant sloths, intersecting with mammoth paths, showing not a chase, but a dance across the Ice Age mud. Each print is a heartbeat, each stride a decision. And then further north at mammoth kill sites in Siberia and Ukraine, bones are found in spirals, not scattered by scavengers but placed, arranged, deliberate, a tusk used as a brace, a femur as a weight. Around them, blades of flint, flakes of obsidian, bits of sinew, ash. To the untrained eye, it might seem like chaos. To a trained archaeologist, it's choreography. This is where science meets story, where soil chemistry, bone weathering, and fracture patterns all tell us not just what happened, but how it happened. A broken pelvis may show a fall. A crushed rib cage might signal the final blow. The spacing of butchery marks tells us where the hunters stood, how they divided the labor, which tools were passed down first. And then comes the DNA. From a tooth, a sliver of bone, a strand of mammoth hair preserved in Siberian permafrost, older than civilization. We can read it now like a scroll, understanding what herds looked like, how they migrated, even how they inbred under the pressure of a dying world. But among the most haunting discoveries is not the mammoth DNA. It's ours. Because scattered among the remains, near the fire pits, the butchered bones, the shelters of mammoth ivory, are traces of people. Homo sapiens, our ancestors, people with our blood, our biology, our fears. They were us, but harder, smarter in a way we forgot to respect. Because for too long, we labeled them primitive. We imagined them as crude, grunting brutes swinging spears at anything that moved. We turned them into cartoons, into museum mannequins and children's books with bad posture and blank stares. But the truth is far more profound. These people outwitted creatures the size of dump trucks, creatures capable of goring a man with a single sideways toss of the head. And they did it not with brute force, but with patience, with memory, with planning. That is not primitive. That is genius. They learned to see the landscape as a machine and themselves as its engineers. They read wind patterns, noticed how snow crusted near cliffs, timed their movement with the moon and the migration of birds. They knew that if the herd turned left, the entire strategy changed. And they passed this knowledge on without paper, without recordings, through memory, gesture, story, song. What they built wasn't just a trap for a mammoth. It was the foundation of culture. And that brings us to ethnoarchaeology. Because to understand the past, sometimes we must listen to the present. Scientists today are turning to indigenous communities who still hunt with similar methods, not to romanticize, but to learn. The San people of the Kalahari still track prey across deserts with a sensitivity that borders on telepathy. Inuit hunters read ice cracks, and seal breathing holds the way others read poetry. These aren't Stone Age cultures. They are living libraries. And through their eyes, we start to understand what Ice Age humans knew. That survival is not about dominance. It's about relationship, awareness, symbiosis. The mammoth hunters of 20,000 years ago weren't gods, but they weren't cavemen either. They were thinkers, strategists, and above all, cooperators, because the greatest tool of all wasn't flint or fire. It was each other. They survived an ice age not because they were the strongest, but because they could plan together, adapt together, mourn together, hope together. And that might be the single most important lesson they leave us. Because here we are now, in our age of steel and satellites and artificial intelligence, still trying to answer the same question. How do we outthink danger? The danger is different now. It's not a charging mammoth, it's a changing climate, a fractured world, fragile ecosystems and fragile economies and fragile minds. But the solution remains the same. Think together, act together, adapt with intention. Because deep inside every one of us is the echo of those early hunters, moving quietly across the snow, eyes scanning the horizon, hand gripping the shoulder of a friend. Not for war, not for conquest, but for survival. And that echo still calls to us. We may no longer walk barefoot across frozen valleys or steer giants into death pits, but we carry the same instincts, the same hunger to understand, to collaborate, to protect the ones we love through more than strength, through intelligence. The next time someone tells you our ancestors were stupid or savage, remember the child's footprints beside the mammoth bones. Remember the cliff edge where the land became a trap. Remember the frozen fire rings, the tusks carved with memory. And say it clearly. They weren't primitive. They were brilliant. And so are we when we choose to be. This story of mammoth hunting isn't just history. It's a mirror. And what it reflects is how deeply human we've always been. Now, as the last mammoth bones are packed away and the last echoes fade into the frost, we come to the closing chapter. Not a hunt, but a homecoming. A final moment to step back and ask, what do we carry forward? What is the legacy of those who hunted giants without weapons? Let's find out. There is a place in the Arctic Ocean where mammoths did not die when the rest of the world moved on. A lonely stretch of tundra called Rangel Island. Here, isolated by rising seas, a small population of mammoths lived on, long after their mainland kin were gone, long after the great hunts ended, long after the earth began to warm and the ice began to melt. These were not prehistoric beasts in a distant, unreachable past. The last of them died only 4,000 years ago. Which means that while Egyptians were stacking stone to touch the sky, the last mammoth was still breathing, still walking, still remembering a colder world. We like to imagine extinction as ancient, clean, tidy, but it is. The mammoths didn't vanish in a single moment. They dwindled, faded, watched the ice shrink beneath their feet. They were not hunted to the last, at least not on Rangel, but they were pushed by warming climates, by habitat loss, and yes, by us. Whether it was direct or not, we were part of the story, and we remember them. In myths, they became monsters, thunder beasts, earth shakers. In parts of Siberia, mammoth bones buried deep in the permafrost gave rise to the legend of the underground elephant, a creature so enormous it lived below the earth, surfacing only in floods or earthquakes. In North American folklore, mammoths became gods of the land, spirits of endurance and memory. But maybe what we were really trying to say was, we miss them. Because in killing the mammoth, we also ended a relationship that shaped us. They weren't just prey, they were our rivals, our mirror, our test. They forced us to become human, not just anatomically, but intellectually, emotionally. To track a mammoth was to read time across the ground. To hunt one was to engineer the world. To kill one was to confront mortality, meaning, and consequence. In the blood of a fallen mammoth was the birth of story. And in the shared silence after the kill, the breathless awe, the firelight flickering on faces young and old, culture was born. They didn't just give us meat. They gave us memory. And perhaps that's why the hunt still echoes across our history. Why mammoths appear in cave art 20,000 years old. Why their bones became shelters, their tusks became sculpture, and their image still looms in our collective imagination. We didn't just outlive the mammoth. We learned from it. We learned how to cooperate, to adapt, to outthink. This is the quiet genius of our ancestors. They were not conquerors. They were improvisers, engineers without blueprints, leaders without maps, hunters without weapons who turned physics into strategy, who turned danger into design. We have inherited that ingenuity, that quiet, burning will to find a way. The story of mammoth hunting isn't about domination. It's not about triumph over nature. It's about partnership with it, about understanding the rhythm of the world so deeply you can move within it like a whisper, change its shape without breaking its bones. It's about solving impossible problems with impossible odds and surviving anyway. We think of progress as steel and circuits and satellites, but progress is also a child watching a mammoth vanish over the hill, remembering the gesture her father used to signal danger. It's a grandmother telling how her brother fell in the hunt and how they buried him beneath the same sky. It's memory made durable. The mammoth is gone, but what it meant to the humans who faced it remains. So the next time you see a tusk in a museum, or an illustration of a mammoth towering over a band of hunters, remember, they weren't primitive. They weren't lucky. They were brilliant. And they didn't conquer the mammoth. They outsmarted it. That's what made us who we are. That's what still can. Because even now, standing at the edge of our own unknowns, we are once again the same creatures staring down a world bigger than us. And if we're quiet enough and brave enough, maybe we can hear their echo somewhere deep beneath the snow and memory. Not a roar, not a charge, just the sound of footsteps in the ice, and the knowledge that we've always found a way. We just have to remember how.